Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're really getting into the latest on Ukraine, specifically those peace talks in Istanbul recently, what happened right after, and President Trump's, evolving role in all this.
Exactly. We've looked at reports from places like the Kyiv Independent, AP, Newsweek, Al Jazeera, WION, quite a few sources, actually.
Yeah, trying to get that broad picture for you.
And our goal here really is to piece together the key developments, understand the sticking points, the different viewpoints. We want to give you a clear sense of the diplomatic situation right now.
Without getting too bogged down in every single detail.
Precisely.
Okay, so Istanbul, May 16th. These were direct talks, Ukraine and Russia face-to-face.
That's right. They met in Istanbul. But truth be told, there weren't any major breakthroughs on ending the war itself.
Not really surprising, maybe.
Perhaps not. The main concrete thing to come out of it was an agreement on a prisoner exchange, 1,000 for 1,000 swap.
Which is significant for the people involved, of course. A human element amidst the politics.
Definitely. But you mentioned the politics. The Russian delegation itself raised some eyebrows, didn't it?
It did seem notable. Tell us about that.
Well, it was led by Vladimir Medinsky, who's an aide to Putin, not, say, a top minister. And the rest were mostly deputy ministers, lower-level people. Foreign Minister Lavrov wasn't there.
So what does that signal? Maybe a lack of real commitment from the top.
That's certainly how President Zelenskyy interpreted it. He didn't hold back.
What did he say?
He called it a sham delegation, basically saying, Putin isn't serious about peace if this is who he sends. It also kind of questions the authority of anyone there to make real decisions.
Right, undermining the whole process, potentially. So what were the Russians actually asking for in these talks?
Well, their core demand was for Ukraine to pull its troops out of all of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson Oblasts.
The full regions, even the parts Russia doesn't actually control.
Exactly. Even though they don't fully occupy those areas, and their annexation claims from 2022 aren't recognized internationally, it's a pretty maximalist position.
Which must be complete non-starter for Kyiv.
Pretty much. We heard from an unnamed source in Zelensky's office who called it unrealistic and clearly unacceptable. It really highlights that fundamental disagreement over territory. It's just a massive hurdle.
And it wasn't just about land, was it? What about a ceasefire? That seems pretty crucial.
Yeah, crucial, but apparently not on the table from Russia's side. Poland's Prime Minister Tusk came out saying Russia essentially broke off negotiations and refused to ceasefire.
So, talking while the fighting actively continues.
That's the stark reality, yes. Yeah. Diplomacy happening alongside ongoing conflict.
But going back to the one positive you mentioned, the prisoner exchange.
Yeah.
That is something tangible.
Absolutely. It's a concrete step. Ukraine's security service, the SBU, was already preparing for it, and the expectation was that the actual exchange would happen the following week. That's real hope for those prisoners and their families.
Okay. Now, how did Russia frame these talks? It's always useful to understand their narrative.
Well, they presented it as sort of picking up where talks left off in 2022. They emphasized needing to address the, quote, root causes of the war.
Which usually means their concerns about NATO, Ukraine's alignment, that sort of thing.
Yes, typically. And interestingly, Foreign Minister Lavrov, even though he wasn't there, was reported to see a, quote, constructive role from Washington in encouraging Kyiv to actually resume talks.
Constructive. And what about the official Kremlin line? Peskov, the spokesperson.
Peskov raised questions about who in Kyiv actually has the authority to sign any final deal. That seemed to be a key point for them.
Casting doubt on Zelensky's government, perhaps?
Could be interpreted that way. He also made it clear that a Putin-Zelensky meeting would only happen after progress was made on an actual agreement text at lower levels. So, setting preconditions.
Okay, so Istanbul wraps up. POW exchange agreed. But massive disagreements remain. What happened immediately after? The international reaction.
Right after the talks, Zelenskyy had a pretty significant phone call. He spoke with President Trump and also Macron from France, Merz from Germany, Starmer from the UK, and Tusk from Poland. Quite the lineup.
Sounds like he was quickly trying to shore up international support and coordinate next steps.
Exactly. His message was basically, Ukraine is ready for peace, but we need strong international unity. And if Russia doesn't stop fighting, then sanctions and pressure need to ramp up.
And the European leaders. Were they on the same page?
It seems so. Tusk directly called for more pressure on Russia. Starmer mentioned Russia's position was unacceptable and stressed aligning their response with both Zelenskyy and President Trump suggests a coordinated front, at least among those leaders.
But even with all this diplomacy, the violence didn't stop, did it?
Tragically, no. The very next day, May 17th, there was a Russian drone attack in Sumy. It hit a bus, killed 9 civilians. Ukraine called it a cynical war crime. Zelenskyy demanded tougher sanctions again. Russia's Ministry of Defense claimed they hit military equipment, but Zelenskyy pointed out the victims were all civilians, including a family. A really grim reminder of the human cost.
Yeah, absolutely devastating. Okay, let's shift focus a bit to President Trump's role. His stance seems to have been, well, let's say dynamic.
Dynamic is one word for it, yes. Initially, right after Istanbul, he sounded somewhat optimistic.
Briefly.
Very briefly. Then he quickly walked that back, acknowledging the lack of real progress. Reports suggest there's definitely frustration building in the White House over the stalemate.
And what about his famous claim?
Yeah.
That he could end the war in 24 hours?
He's addressed that. He said recently it was meant to be sarcastic.
Sarcastic.
Yeah, he still says he wants it resolved quickly and thinks he can do it, but obviously the timeline shifted. That 100-day deadline he set for himself when he took office, that came and went.
But he has been engaging directly, right? Talks with both sides.
Yes, reportedly. He's had, quote, very serious discussions with Russia, and he spoke with both Putin and Zelenskyy back in February and March.
Though that February meeting with Zelenskyy sounded pretty tense from the reports we saw.
It did. Apparently Trump was quite critical of Zelenskyy. He even called off the signing of some minerals deal they had planned. The reason given was supposedly Zelenskyy's hatred for Putin being an obstacle to peace.
Wow. And there have been actions, too, like pausing military aid.
That's right. The administration did temporarily halt military aid. The thinking seemed to be it would pressure Zelenskyy towards negotiating peace. Trump also publicly criticized Zelenskyy for not giving up Crimea and for prolonging the, quote, killing field.
But then he's also criticized Putin at times. It seems to cut both ways.
Yes, which adds to the unpredictability. There was that instance where he directly told Putin to stop P after a bad attack on Kyiv, so it's not consistently focused on just one side.
So, looking forward, what's Trump planning next?
He announced he's got a call scheduled with Putin for May 19th. The stated aim is ending the bloodbath. He also said he plans to call Zelenskyy again and NATO allies.
And he mentioned sanctions.
Yes. He's threatened sanctions on Moscow if these peace efforts fail. So maybe a return to a harder line if diplomacy doesn't work out quickly.
And Secretary of State Rubio weighed in, too.
He did. Rubio suggested the U.S. might need to, quote, move on from peace efforts if there isn't quick progress. He said pretty bluntly, it's not our war.
Not our war. That's a strong statement.
It is. And Trump apparently agreed with Rubio that a deal needs to happen fast, though he didn't explicitly say he'd just walk away from diplomacy altogether.
Okay, so pulling back for a wider view, what are the big obstacles, the underlying issues preventing a resolution here?
Well, several things stand out. Putin not showing up in Istanbul himself, that was seen by many as a sign he wasn't fully invested in that particular round, at least.
Right. Optics matter.
They do. Then there are Russia's core demands about territory. Insisting Ukraine cede those 4 regions is just. It's a fundamental sticking point, likely impossible for Kyiv. And the refusal to even agree to a ceasefire in Istanbul, that speaks volumes about their current military posture.
What about Zelenskyy? Any signs of flexibility on his side?
He has said he's ready for direct talks with Putin. But, crucially, he stressed needing security guarantees from the U.S. and Europe.
Ah, so talks with guarantees. That's interesting. Maybe a slight shift from earlier positions on things like NATO, perhaps?
It's possible. The specifics aren't clear, but framing it around guarantees might offer a different avenue than focusing solely on formal alliances. Needs watching.
You mentioned the U.S.-Ukraine relationship seeming strained under Trump.
Yeah, reports definitely suggest tension there. The pressure tactics, the shifting rhetoric, it seems to have caused friction, not just with Kyiv, but also with some NATO allies who prefer a more, consistently supportive line.
And all this happens while the fighting grinds on.
Exactly. Russia still occupies roughly 20% of Ukraine. And attacks like the one in Sumy are a constant, brutal reminder that the war is very much ongoing.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways for you?
Well, I think it's clear the Istanbul talks didn't really move the needle much beyond the important prisoner exchange. The core disagreements are still huge. President Trump's involvement is obviously central, but his, let's call it unique approach, adds layers of complexity and uncertainty.
Yeah, unpredictable is definitely a word that comes to mind.
And the international community is still struggling, really, to find a way to de-escalate things and forge a path to a lasting peace. It's incredibly challenging.
It really is. Which leads us to a final thought for you, our listener. to ponder.
Mm-hmm.
Given everything we've discussed, the deep divisions, the history here, Trump's approach, the ongoing war, what kind of fundamental shifts might actually be needed? From Ukraine, from Russia, from the U.S., from Europe? What would it take to create a genuine chance for peace? And, realistically, what role can outside powers even play in making that happen?
Yeah, those are the tough questions, aren't they? No easy answers in sight.
Definitely not. Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.